The lunar dust swirled, a miniature white tornado against the black canvas of the sky. Omar squinted, the glare intense even through his polarized visor. The deep drilling team had hit something unexpected, hard and deep. A colleague deeper than the geological scans had predicted. His reputation hung in the balance. A past misjudgment, a calculation error that cost the corporation dearly, had relegated him to this desolate outpost. This discovery, this anomaly, was his chance to climb back, to prove he wasn't just another washed-up geologist exiled to the moon. "Report," Omar barked into his comm, the sound echoing in the cramped confines of the weather station. "Drill's locked, sir." The technician's voice crackled back, strained. "We've hit an obstruction. Something unnatural." Omar felt a prickle of unease. Unnatural how? Density readings are off the charts. It's like hitting solid nothing. He pulled on his thermal gloves, the synthetic material oddly slick against his skin. "I'm coming down." The descent into the newly opened cavern was a slow, grinding affair. The lift groaned under the weight of its cargo, the air thick with the metallic tang of lunar dust and the faint ozone scent of the drill. As he stepped out onto the cavern floor, the sheer scale of the space stole his breath. It was vast, a cathedral of rock and shadow, illuminated by the harsh glare of the floodlights. And there it was, a monolith. It stood impossibly tall, a stark obsidian shard piercing the lunar crust. The agent surface was smooth, seamless, reflecting the light in strange, distorted patterns. It looked like no rock, no mineral he had ever seen. The air around it shimmered, a subtle distortion that made his eyes ache. "Sensors are going haywire," the officer said, his voice tight with apprehension. "Energy readings are spiking, then dropping. It's erratic." Omar approached cautiously, his boots crunching on the loose rock. As he drew closer, he felt it. A pressure, a subtle hum that resonated deep within his skull. It wasn't a sound, not exactly, but a vibration, a feeling of wrongness that made his teeth ache. He reached out, his gloved hand hovering just inches from the surface of the monolith. The obsidian felt strangely warm, radiating a heat that defied the frigid lunar temperatures. The subtle hum intensified, the pressure in his head building. "Get back, sir!" the technician yelled, his voice panicked. "I'm reading a surge!" Omar ignored him, his gaze fixed on the monolith. He had to know. He had to understand. His fingers brushed against the smooth surface. The world exploded. A guard with light, not with sound, but with sensation. A flood of images, of emotions, of alien thoughts that overwhelmed his mind. He saw things he couldn't comprehend, geometries that defied reality, horrors that lurked in the spaces between stars. He staggered back, his head reeling, his stomach churning. The pressure intensified, a crushing weight that threatened to shatter his skull. He could hear the others shouting, but their voices were distant, muffled, as if he were underwater. The monolith hummed louder, the vibration now a palpable force that shook the very ground beneath his feet. He saw the technician clutching his head, his face contorted in pain. The officer was on his knees, retching. Omar forced himself to focus, to fight against the encroaching madness. He had to shut it down. He had to stop whatever was happening. He stumbled towards the control panel, his fingers fumbling with the switches. He needed to sever the power, to cut off the energy flow to the monolith. But as he reached for the main breaker, he saw it. A flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. Something shifting, something growing on the surface of the obsidian. A crack. A hairline fracture that spiderwebbed across the smooth surface, glowing with an inner light. The hum intensified. The pressure reached a crescendo, and Omar knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they had awakened something ancient, something terrible. and it was about to be unleashed. The fissure pulsed with sickly green light. The technician screamed, a raw animal sound that echoed through the cavern. The officer scrambled backwards, his face pale, eyes wide with terror. Omar felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal urge to flee. But he stood his ground. He had to. He was in charge. "Seal it!" he roared, his voice barely audible above the cacophony. "Seal the cavern, now!" He watched as the technician, trembling, fumbled with the controls, initiating the emergency protocols. A colleague slammed shut, sealing off the cavern from the rest of the mining complex. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and burning metal. He felt the tremor in his bones as the monolith continued to hum, the vibrations resonating through the very structure of the moon. An agent in the weather station, days blurred into a haze of anxiety and mounting chaos. The incident in the cavern, which he now referred to as the anomaly, was quickly spiraling beyond his control. A guard things at first. A figure malfunctions. A flickering light, a broken comm system, a malfunctioning atmospheric regulator. Annoying, but explainable. A person came the accidents. A twisted ankle, a laceration from a misplaced tool, a burn from a faulty welding torch. A witness concerning, but still within the realm of probability. But now it was different. An officer it was in the realm of impossible. The dreams started subtly. A detective night's, fitful sleep, a general sense of unease. He'd wake in a cold sweat, the lingering feeling of dread clinging to him like lunar dust. He dismissed it as stress. The pressure of command, the weight of responsibility. He pushed it aside, focused on the mission, on maintaining order. But the others, they weren't handling it so well. One of the miners, a hulking man named Boris, normally stoic and unflappable, had become withdrawn, paranoid. He'd stare into the shadows, muttering about whispers and eyes in the dark. Omar had tried to reassure him, telling him it was just fatigue, the isolation getting to him. But Boris wouldn't listen. He insisted he could hear voices, feel eyes watching him from the darkness. The air inside the weather station hung heavy, thick with a palpable tension. The fluorescent lights hummed with a discordant buzz, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls. The metallic tang of recycled air filled his nostrils, a constant reminder of their artificial existence, their isolation from the natural world. Omar sat at his console, reviewing the sensor logs, searching for any anomalies, any patterns that might explain the escalating incidents. The readings were erratic, fluctuating wildly. There was no logical explanation, no scientific basis for what was happening. He rubbed his tired eyes, the gritty lunar dust clinging to his skin. He had to find a solution. He had to regain control. He couldn't let this spiral into complete chaos. He was in charge, and he had to maintain order even if it killed him. Suddenly, a scream pierced the tense silence. It was Boris. Omar jumped to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest. He raced towards the sound, his boots clanging on the metal floor. He found Boris near the entrance to the sealed cavern, his body contorted, his face a mask of pure terror. He was clawing at his eyes, screaming about whispers and shadows, about things crawling beneath the surface. "They're watching! They're always watching!" Boris shrieked, his voice raw and ragged. "I can hear them. They're whispering my name." Omar tried to approach him to calm him down, but Boris lashed out, his eyes wide with unadulterated fear. "Get away from me," he screamed. "You can't see them, but they see you. They see all of us." Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Boris's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floor, his body convulsing. A colleague rushed to his side, checking for a pulse. Omar stood frozen, his mind reeling. He stared at Boris's prone form, at the sweat-soaked hair plastered to his forehead, at the vacant expression on his face. The silence in the weather station was deafening, broken only by the ragged breathing of the others. He had tried to explain it away. Stress, fatigue, isolation. But he could no longer deny the truth. Something was happening. Something unnatural. And it was getting worse. The air felt charged, heavy with an unseen presence. The whispers seemed to echo in the corners of his mind. He looked towards the sealed cavern, towards the source of the anomaly. A cold dread washed over him. He realized with a chilling certainty that they were not alone. And whatever was down there, in the depths of the moon, was now reaching out. He knelt beside Boris, his own breath catching in his throat. The technician was checking Boris's pulse, his brow furrowed with concern. The tremor in Boris's hand was unmistakable, a subtle yet violent spasm that belied the man's apparent stillness. "Get him to his quarters," Omar said, his voice raspy. "See if you can get him to rest." 2 guards lifted Boris, their movements clumsy and uncertain. They carried him away, his limp body a stark reminder of their vulnerability. The metallic tang of fear hung heavy in the air, mingling with the recycled air, creating a nauseating concoction. Omar stood, his gaze fixed on the sealed cavern. He had to understand what was happening, what this thing was doing to them. He had to find a way to stop it. He turned to the remaining crew members, his voice firm, trying to project an authority he no longer felt. Omar wanted a full diagnostic sweep of the weather station. Every system, every sensor. Omar wanted to know everything that's going on in this facility. The others nodded, their faces pale and drawn. They moved with a newfound urgency, their fear a palpable motivator. Omar watched them, his mind racing. He had to isolate the anomaly, contain it before it consumed them all. He strode towards the comm station, his boots echoing on the metal floor. He activated the secure channel, his fingers trembling slightly as he entered the authorization code. "This is Omar," he said, his voice tight. "Omar need a secure channel to Central Command. A colleague won." The response was immediate, a crackling voice filled with static and concern. "Omar, what's the situation? They're picking up some unusual readings from your sector." "They have a situation here," Omar said, his voice low and urgent. "An anomaly. Omar need authorization to initiate containment protocol, level 3. There was a pause, a moment of stunned silence. "Level 3? Omar, are you sure? That requires complete isolation of the weather station." "Omar, I'm sure," Omar said, his voice unwavering. "It's the only way." He could feel the weight of their hesitation, the gravity of his decision. But he knew he had no choice. He had to protect the rest of the colony, even if it meant sacrificing himself. "Authorization granted," the voice finally said. "Initiate containment protocol. Godspeed, Omar." He severed the connection, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. He turned to the others, his gaze sweeping over their faces. "They're going into lockdown," he said, his voice clear and resolute. "No one in, no one out. They're going to isolate this thing, contain it before it spreads." The air grew thick with tension, the silence broken only by the hum of the monolith, a low, resonant drone that seemed to vibrate in their very bones. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, swirling around him like a malevolent vortex. He could almost make out words, fragments of an ancient language, a language he had never heard, yet somehow understood. Cathar. Aurelia. The agent Eftan. The words echoed in his mind, chilling him to the core. He stumbled, his vision blurring, his head throbbing with a searing pain. He pressed his hands to his ears, trying to block out the whispers, but they were inside his head, a constant, relentless torment. He could feel his grip on reality slipping, his mind fraying at the edges. A technician cried out, clutching his head, his body convulsing. A colleague stared blankly ahead, her eyes wide and unseeing. The officer began to pace, muttering to himself, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and anger. Omar watched them, his heart sinking. He could feel the anomaly spreading, infecting them all. He had to do something, anything, to stop it. He staggered towards the control panel, his fingers fumbling with the controls. He activated the emergency shielding, the heavy metal plates sliding into place, sealing off the cavern from the rest of the weather station. The hum of the monolith intensified, the vibrations growing stronger, shaking the very foundations of the facility. The whispers reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices screaming in his mind. He slammed his fist on the activation button, initiating the final stage of the containment protocol. A surge of power coursed through the weather station, the lights flickering violently. He watched, his breath catching in his throat as the shielded chamber sealed shut, encasing the anomaly in a cage of steel and energy. The hum began to subside, the vibrations lessening, the whispers fading into a dull, distant murmur. He stood there, panting, his body trembling, his mind reeling. He had done it. He had contained the anomaly. But at what cost? He looked at them, their faces etched with terror and confusion. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and fear, the silence broken only by the ragged breathing of the others. He realized with a sinking feeling that the battle was far from over. The whispers might be fainter, but they were still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever was down there in the depths of the moon was not going to stay silent for long. Omar spun, grabbing the comms panel. He had to send a distress signal. The colony needed to know what they faced. "Secure channel command," he barked, his voice raspy. The static crackled, loud in the tense silence. "Omar, report," the voice on the other end demanded. "They registered a level 3 containment. What is the situation?" "Containment is partial," Omar said, choosing his words carefully. He didn't want to incite panic, not yet. The artifact is isolated, but its influence. It's affecting the crew. They need immediate assistance. This is beyond them, beyond this weather station. "Explain affecting," the voice pressed, laced with suspicion. A colleague Omar could answer. A piercing shriek tore through the station. A technician was writhing on the floor, his body contorted at unnatural angles. His screams echoed off the metal walls, mingling with the incessant hum of the monolith, now a barely audible thrum beneath the surface of their awareness. The air tasted like copper, sharp and metallic, a phantom scent clinging to the back of Omar's throat. "Omar, what was that?" The voice on the comms crackled, urgency rising. "They have a situation here," Omar shouted, his voice strained. "They're losing them. They need help, now." He severed the connection, his hands shaking, his heart pounding against his ribs. The technician's screams intensified, cutting through the recycled air like a blade. The officer, who had been pacing erratically, suddenly stopped. His eyes, wide and vacant, locked onto Omar. A slow, unsettling smile spread across his lips. "Liberation," the officer crooned, his voice a distorted whisper. "They will be free." He lunged towards the control panel, his movements jerky and unnatural. Omar reacted instantly, tackling him to the ground. The officer thrashed wildly, his strength amplified, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. "No!" Omar yelled, struggling to restrain him. "They can't let it out." The technician watching looked on in horror. Omar noticed a colleague approach, clearly disturbed by the officer's outburst. "Stop him!" Omar roared. The colleague, hesitant, moved towards the struggling pair. But as he neared, his expression changed. His eyes glazed over, mirroring the officer's vacant stare. He turned and sprinted towards the life support systems panel. "No, Agent, the life support!" Omar screamed, shoving the officer aside. He scrambled to his feet, racing after the colleague. He reached the panel just as the colleague slammed his fist down on the emergency override. A guard blared, red lights flashing, bathing the weather station in a hellish glow. The hum of the monolith intensified, vibrating through the floor, up his legs, into his very bones. The air grew heavy, stifling, the recycled atmosphere turning stale and acrid. "They are opening the way," the colleague chanted, his voice a monotone drone. "They will be free." Omar grabbed the colleague, pulling him away from the panel. The colleague fought back with surprising ferocity, his eyes filled with a terrifying, inhuman glee. "They must stop them," Omar shouted, his voice barely audible above the alarms. "They must reseal the cavern." The officer, now back on his feet, moved towards another control panel. This one controlled the outer docking clamps. Omar realized with horror what he was trying to do. "He's trying to breach the hull," Omar yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. "They have to stop him." He knew, with a sickening certainty, that if they opened the outer hull, whatever was influencing them would escape. And the colony, the entire moon base, would be doomed. He charged towards the officer, his heart pounding, his mind racing. The officer grinned, his fingers hovering over the release mechanism. Omar launched himself forward, tackling the officer once more. They crashed to the floor, a tangled mess of limbs and desperation. The officer's hand slipped, his fingers brushing against the release. A loud hiss filled the air, followed by a grinding metallic groan. A tremor ran through the weather station, shaking the very foundations of their fragile existence. Outside, the vacuum of space beckoned, promising oblivion. The artifact was winning. The grinding groan of the docking clamps opening was a death knell. The tremor intensified, dust raining down from the ceiling panels. A chilling wind, laced with the metallic tang of space, whipped through the weather station. Omar scrambled to his feet, his ears ringing, his chest aching. The officer was regaining his footing, his eyes burning with that terrifying vacant intensity. The colleague, still locked onto the life support panel, continued his monotone chant. "They will be free. The way is opening." He had to act, and fast. "Seal the breach," Omar roared, pointing towards the emergency bulkhead controls. "Now." The technician, still trembling, finally seemed to snap out of his paralysis. He stumbled towards the controls, his fingers fumbling with the activation sequence. But the officer was too quick. A colleague, a guttural snarl, he lunged at the technician, knocking him aside like a rag doll. The technician hit the wall with a sickening thud and did not move. Omar swore, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He charged at the officer, aiming for a solid hit. But the officer sidestepped with unnatural agility, grabbing Omar's arm and twisting it with brutal force. An agent shot up Omar's arm, his vision swimming. He cried out, struggling to break free. He had to find a way to stop them, to contain this madness before it consumed them all. He glanced at the colleague, his movements still robotic and intent. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that these weren't just simple breakdowns. The artifact's influence was far deeper, more insidious than he had imagined. The officer threw Omar against the wall. Omar's head cracked against the metal, and spots danced before his eyes. The officer advanced, his smile widening, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than before. "They are coming," the officer whispered, his voice a raspy echo. "They will merge with them. They will be one." The technician, groaning, tried to push himself up, but his limbs seemed to buckle beneath him. The weather station itself seemed to be groaning, the hum of the artifact growing louder, resonating deep within his bones. Omar knew he couldn't fight them like this. They were stronger, faster, driven by something he couldn't comprehend. He needed a plan, a way to outsmart them, He needed to escape the immediate influence of the artifact. He spotted a maintenance hatch leading to a narrow access tunnel. It was a long shot, but it was their only chance. They're not going to let that thing out. Omar gasped, buying himself time. They'll find a way to stop it. The officer paused, his eyes narrowing. A flicker of something, doubt, perhaps, crossed his face. It was all the opening Omar needed. He kicked out, catching the officer off balance. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in his head. "Run!" Omar yelled at the technician. "Get to the tunnels!" The technician, still dazed, hesitated. Omar grabbed his arm, yanking him towards the maintenance hatch. He wrestled with the stubborn release lever, his fingers slipping on the cold metal. Finally, with a groan, the hatch popped open. A gust of stale, recycled air rushed out, carrying with it the faint scent of ozone and decay. Omar shoved the technician through the opening and followed, slamming the hatch shut behind him. He fumbled with the locking mechanism, securing it just as the officer slammed against the other side. The metal buckled, but held. They were safe, for now. The tunnel was dark and cramped, the air thick and heavy. The hum of the artifact was fainter here, but still present, a persistent thrumming that vibrated through the metal walls. "What was that all about, Omar?" the technician said, his voice trembling. "What's happening to them?" Omar looked at him, his expression grim. "They're not them anymore," he said, his voice low. "There's something else, and whatever it is, it wants to get out." He started moving through the tunnel, deeper into the labyrinthine underbelly of the lunar base. They needed to find a way to disable the artifact, to sever its influence before it consumed them all. He had a feeling that time was running out. The technician's voice was a thin thread in the oppressive dark of the access tunnel. Omar ignored the question, focusing on the cold, slick metal under his hands as he felt for the next handhold. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of recycled air and something else. Something ancient and alien that prickled at the back of his throat. The tunnel was barely wide enough to shuffle through, and the low ceiling forced him to hunch, a dull ache blooming in his lower back. "They need to get to the comms array," Omar said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "Warn Earth. Or find a way to destroy that thing. The artifact. It was all his fault for being so ambitious and wanting to get the artifact back to Earth and the rest of his team. The weight of that decision settled heavy on his shoulders. He pushed forward, the technician close behind. Each step was a muffled clang on the metal floor, the sound amplified in the claustrophobic space. The faint hum of the artifact still vibrated through the walls, a constant reminder of the growing threat. They reached a junction, two tunnels branching off into the darkness. Omar paused, trying to recall the base schematics. The comms array was located on the far side of the habitat module. That meant... "This way," Omar said, pointing to the left tunnel. He wasn't sure, but it was the only choice he had. He moved forward, the technician trailing behind him. As they moved, the hum of the artifact intensified, morphing into a low, guttural drone that seemed to seep into his very bones. A wave of nausea washed over him, and his head throbbed. He pressed on, determined to reach the comms array. Suddenly, the tunnel lurched, throwing Omar off balance. The technician cried out, grabbing onto the wall for support. The lights flickered and died, plunging them into absolute darkness. "What was that?" The technician gasped, his voice laced with panic. Omar fumbled for his flashlight, his fingers slick with sweat. He clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing the tunnel walls shaking violently. A colleague rained down from the ceiling, stinging his eyes. "Earthquake?" the technician asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Omar don't think so," Omar said grimly. "Omar think it's... the artifact. It's getting stronger." He shone the flashlight ahead, revealing a section of the tunnel wall bulging outwards. An agent spiderwebbed across the metal surface, and a faint, eerie glow emanated from within. "They need to get out of here," Omar said, his voice urgent. "Now!" He grabbed the technician's arm and pulled him forward, running blindly through the shaking tunnel. The ground beneath them bucked and swayed, making it difficult to keep their footing. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and burning metal. They rounded a corner and stumbled into a small maintenance room. The room was filled with tools and equipment, all rattling and clanging in the violent tremor. A computer terminal flickered to life on one wall, displaying a chaotic jumble of data. Omar ignored the chaos and scanned the room, his eyes searching for anything that could help them. He spotted a diagnostics panel for the base's power grid. He rushed over to it, his fingers flying across the controls. "What are you doing?" the technician asked, his voice strained. "Omar, I'm trying to analyze the artifact's energy signature," Omar said, his voice tight with concentration. "See if Omar can figure out what it's doing." The screen flickered, displaying a complex waveform. Omar studied it intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. The waveform pulsed with an unnatural energy, and he realized with a growing sense of dread that it wasn't just transmitting. "It's not just transmitting," Omar said, his voice low. It's absorbing something." "Absorbing what?" the technician asked, his voice trembling. "Organic matter," Omar said grimly. "Consciousness. It's taking it from them. A guard, the others." The technician gasped, his eyes wide with horror. Omar continued to study the waveform, his mind racing. The artifact was not just a source of corruption. It was actively consuming them, merging them into something new. "It's forming something," Omar said, his voice barely a whisper. "A unified entity. It's using them to build itself." A sudden, deafening crash echoed through the tunnel. The technician screamed. Omar grabbed his flashlight and shone it towards the entrance of the room. The tunnel wall had collapsed, blocking their path. A figure amidst the rubble was the officer, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "They are waiting," the officer rasped, his voice a distorted echo. "They are ready to join. They will be one." The officer's voice scraped against Omar's ears, a digital rasp that sent shivers down his spine. He gripped the flashlight tighter, the beam dancing across the officer's contorted features. The glowing eyes burned with an alien intensity, and the skin seemed to ripple beneath the surface, as if something were moving inside. "They will be one," the officer repeated, taking a step forward. The rubble crunched beneath his boots. Omar felt a surge of adrenaline. He had to protect the technician, had to find a way to stop this thing. He pushed the technician behind him, raising the flashlight like a weapon. "Stay back!" Omar shouted, his voice trembling slightly. The officer didn't stop. He continued to advance, his glowing eyes fixed on Omar. The air crackled with energy, and the metallic tang intensified, burning Omar's nostrils. The ground trembled again, and more debris rained down from the ceiling. Omar knew they couldn't stay here. They had to move, had to find a way out. But the tunnel was blocked, and the officer stood between them and escape. He had a grim choice to make. "Run!" Omar yelled to the technician, shoving him towards the back of the maintenance room. "Get to the artifact chamber." The technician hesitated, his eyes wide with fear. "But what about you?" "Just go," Omar snapped. "Warn them, a colleague them what's happening." The technician nodded, his face pale. He turned and fled into the darkness, disappearing behind a stack of equipment. Omar turned back to the officer, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he couldn't defeat him, but he could buy the technician some time. He took a deep breath and charged forward, swinging the flashlight with all his might. The beam connected with the officer's head, and he staggered back, momentarily stunned. Omar didn't wait. He scrambled over the rubble, squeezing through the narrow gap in the collapsed tunnel wall. He found himself in a short access tunnel. The walls were lined with pipes and cables, and the air was thick with dust. He ran as fast as he could, his lungs burning, the guttural drone of the artifact pursuing him. He burst into a large chamber. This chamber housed the artifact. The artifact pulsed with a malevolent energy. The walls were covered in strange pictograms, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift before his eyes. Omar ignored the artifact for a moment. The technician needed his help. He shone his flashlight around the chamber, searching for the technician. He spotted him huddled in a corner, his face buried in his hands. "What's wrong?" Omar asked, rushing over to him. The technician looked up, his eyes filled with terror. It's here," he stammered. "It's inside his head." Omar frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" "Omar can hear it," the technician whispered, his voice trembling. "It's speaking to him. It wants him to join it." Omar realized with horror that the artifact's influence was spreading. It was not just transforming them physically. It was invading their minds, corrupting their thoughts. He grabbed the technician's shoulders, shaking him gently. "You have to fight it," he said urgently. "You can't let it control you." He turned his attention to the walls of the chamber. The pictograms. They weren't just decorations. They were a warning. He moved closer, studying the symbols intently. They seemed to depict a cosmic entity of immense power, imprisoned on the moon eons ago. The artifact was its key, a device designed to break free by converting organic life into a suitable form for its escape and expansion. The realization hit Omar like a physical blow. The moon wasn't just a source of resources. It was a prison. And they had just unleashed its prisoner. He noticed a series of data logs etched into the wall beneath the pictograms. The language was alien, but something in their structure resonated with him. They were a record, a history, a warning. Omar ran his hand over the cool stone, feeling the vibrations of the artifact humming in the air. The pictograms seemed to shift again, coalescing into a clearer image of the entity. It was vast, terrifying, its form defying description. It was a being of pure energy, capable of consuming entire worlds. Omar knew what he had to do. He had to find a way to contain the entity, to send it back to its prison. But how? Maybe the logs held the key. Omar strained to decipher the alien logs beneath the pictograms, the air thick with the artifact's hum. It vibrated through the soles of his boots, a dissonant chord that resonated deep within his skull. A metallic tang clung to the air, sharp and cloying, as the technician whimpered beside him. "What do they say?" Omar asked, his voice barely a whisper. The technician shook his head, his gaze fixed on some unseen horror. They want to show him. To join. Omar grit his teeth, forcing his attention back to the alien script. The symbols pulsed with a faint inner light, as if alive. He focused, pushing aside the rising dread, the feeling of being watched by something ancient and immense. The pictograms depicted a cycle: imprisonment, dormancy, awakening, consumption. A horrifyingly simple narrative of cosmic hunger. "They have to find a way to stop it," Omar muttered, his fingers tracing the cold stone. "Before it's too late." He scanned the chamber, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The walls were a mosaic of alien artistry, depicting scenes of unimaginable destruction. A colleague consumed, stars extinguished, all feeding the insatiable appetite of the entity. A low rumble echoed through the chamber, punctuated by the technician's ragged breathing. "Omar, it's getting stronger," the technician choked out. Omar can't fight it." Omar glanced at him, his heart sinking. The technician's eyes were glazed over, unfocused. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was devouring his mind. He had to do something, and fast. He returned to the logs. The symbols were starting to coalesce, forming a rudimentary understanding in his mind. They spoke of a containment field, a barrier erected eons ago to imprison the entity. The field was powered by a network of energy conduits that ran throughout the moon's core. Agent operations had breached the conduits, weakening the field. He found a schematic, a diagram of the moon's interior, highlighting the energy conduits. There was a central node, a nexus point where all the conduits converged. If he could overload the node, he might be able to restore the containment field, at least temporarily. "Omar have a plan," Omar said, his voice regaining a measure of confidence. "But it's going to be dangerous. They need to get to the central node, the main power supply." The technician didn't respond. He just stared blankly ahead, his body trembling. Omar grabbed his arm, shaking him roughly. "Hey, a guard out of it. They need you." The technician blinked, his eyes momentarily clearing. "The power." "Yes." Omar remembered the schematics. "Good," Omar said, relief washing over him. "Can you guide him?" The technician nodded slowly, his gaze still distant. "Yes, Omar thinks so." They moved towards the exit of the chamber, the artifact's hum growing louder, more insistent. The ground trembled violently, and chunks of rock rained down from the ceiling. The lunar colony was tearing itself apart. As they stepped into the access tunnel, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the officer, his form now grotesquely distorted. His skin was stretched taut over his bones, and his eyes glowed with an unnatural light. "You cannot escape," the officer rasped, his voice a guttural growl. "You will become one with them." Omar shoved the technician behind him. "Run, a figure to the node. Omar'll hold him off." The technician hesitated, fear etched on his face. "But, go!" Omar shouted. The technician turned and fled, disappearing down the tunnel. Omar braced himself, facing the transformed officer. He knew he was no match for him, but he had to buy the technician some time. He had to give him a chance. The officer lunged, his contorted features twisted into a grotesque parody of a smile. Omar sidestepped the attack, narrowly avoiding the officer's grasp. He stumbled back, his foot catching on a loose rock. He fell to the ground, his flashlight clattering away. The officer loomed over him, his shadow engulfing him. Omar felt a surge of terror, but he refused to give in. He scrambled to his feet, grabbing a piece of jagged rock. "Omar won't let you win," Omar snarled. "Omar'll die before Omar lets you destroy everything." Omar swung the rock. It connected with a sickening crunch against the officer's skull. The officer staggered, momentarily stunned, but he quickly recovered. His glowing eyes locked onto Omar, burning with malevolent intensity. He swiped at Omar, his grotesque hand tearing through the fabric of Omar's suit, leaving a burning trail across his arm. A colleague shot up Omar's arm, hot and searing. He stumbled backward, desperately trying to create some distance. The air crackled with energy, the artifact's hum now a deafening roar. The ground vibrated violently, making it difficult to maintain his balance. He could feel the entity's presence, a vast, unknowable intelligence that pressed against his mind, probing, searching. "You cannot resist," the officer hissed, his voice a chorus of distorted whispers. "Join us. Agent, the power." Omar spat on the ground. Omar'd rather die. The officer lunged again, faster this time. Omar dodged, but not quickly enough. The officer's hand grazed his side, tearing another gash in his suit. He stumbled, falling against the cold, metallic wall of the access tunnel. His breath came in ragged gasps. He could feel the life draining from him, the entity's influence seeping into his wounds, corrupting his flesh. Suddenly, the officer paused, his eyes widening in what might have been surprise. He stared at Omar, his gaze intense, focused. A strange, knowing smile spread across his distorted features. "There is another way," the officer said, his voice now smooth, seductive. "You do not have to die. You can join us. You can become more than you ever imagined." A vision flooded Omar's mind, unbidden, terrifying. He saw himself bathed in cosmic light, his body dissolving into pure energy. He saw galaxies swirling before him, stars exploding, the secrets of the universe laid bare. He felt an overwhelming sense of power, of limitless potential. It was a temptation unlike any he had ever experienced, a promise of transcendence, of escape from his mundane existence. He could feel the pull, the lure of the entity's power. It offered him everything he had ever secretly desired. An end to his failures. The knowledge of ages. A guard might. Omar squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the vision. He remembered his life, his struggles, his disappointments. He thought of his failed marriage, his dead-end job, his sense of isolation. He had always felt like an outsider, a misfit, a failure. But he also remembered his values, his sense of duty, his loyalty to his crewmates. He would not betray them. He would not succumb to this alien temptation. He opened his eyes, his gaze hardening. "Omar is not afraid of you," Omar said, his voice trembling but firm. "Omar will never join you." The officer's smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure hatred. "Then you will be destroyed," he snarled. He raised his hand, ready to strike the death blow. But before he could act, a figure emerged from the shadows behind him. It was the technician, his face pale but determined. He held a length of metal pipe in his hands, his grip tight. The air hung thick with the smell of ozone and dust. A faint, metallic tang clung to the back of Omar's throat. "Get away from him!" the technician yelled. The officer turned, momentarily distracted. Omar seized the opportunity. He lunged forward, tackling the officer around the legs. The officer stumbled, losing his balance. Omar scrambled to his feet, grabbing the jagged rock he had dropped earlier. He raised it high above his head, his arm trembling with effort. "For everyone!" Omar roared. He brought the rock down with all his might, smashing it against the officer's head. The officer collapsed, his body convulsing on the ground. The glowing light in his eyes flickered and died. Omar stood over him, panting, his body aching, his mind reeling. He had won, for now. But he knew the fight was far from over. The entity was still out there, growing stronger with each passing moment. And the technician's fate, and the fate of the colony, rested on his shoulders. He looked at the technician. "We have to go now." Omar looked at the technician. "We have to go now." The technician nodded, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't need convincing. The air thrummed with a malevolent energy, the artifact's presence growing stronger, more insistent. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every flicker of light danced with unnatural speed. The metallic tang in the air intensified, burning the back of Omar's throat, mingling with the coppery scent of blood. "Where?" the technician asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The comms array," Omar said, his mind racing. "We have to send a warning. Tell them to quarantine the moon. Tell them. Tell them everything." They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing in the narrow tunnel. Omar led the way, his body screaming in protest. The gash on his arm burned like fire, and he could feel the entity's influence trying to worm its way into his thoughts, whispering promises of power, of escape. He pushed it back with every ounce of willpower he possessed. He had to focus. He had to keep moving. The comms array was located on the far side of the weather station, a sprawling complex of metal and machinery perched precariously on the lunar surface. As they approached, Omar could see that the main access door was buckled and twisted, as if something had tried to force its way inside. A low, guttural growl emanated from within, punctuated by the crackle of electrical discharge. "Stay behind me," Omar said, drawing the jagged rock again. He kicked the damaged door, sending it crashing inward. The scene inside was chaotic. A colleague were overturned, wires sparked and spat, and the air was thick with the smell of ozone and burning plastic. In the center of the room, the comms officer was slumped against a wall, his body contorted at an unnatural angle. His eyes glowed with the same malevolent light that Omar had seen in the officer's eyes. The comms officer turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto Omar. A grotesque smile spread across his lips. "You cannot escape," he hissed, his voice a chorus of distorted whispers. "We are everywhere. We are everything." Omar ignored him. He scanned the room, searching for a way to activate the comms array. The main power conduit was severed, sending sparks flying. He needed to reroute the power, but he didn't have the tools. "Technician, can you fix this?" Omar asked, pointing to the damaged conduit. The technician hesitated, his eyes darting nervously around the room. I don't know," he stammered. "It's too dangerous." "We don't have a choice," Omar said, his voice firm. "If we don't send a warning, everyone on Earth will be at risk." The technician took a deep breath and nodded. He moved cautiously towards the damaged conduit, his hands trembling. He rummaged through his tool belt, pulling out a pair of wire cutters and a roll of electrical tape. As the technician worked, Omar stood guard, his senses on high alert. He could feel the entity's presence pressing against his mind, trying to distract him, to weaken his resolve. He fought back, focusing on the technician, on the task at hand. The technician spliced the wires and secured them with electrical tape. A surge of power coursed through the system. The comms array flickered to life, its screens illuminating the room with a pale, ghostly light. "It's working!" the technician exclaimed. "I've got a signal!" Omar rushed to the console, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He uploaded a distress signal, a desperate plea for help. He detailed everything that had happened: the discovery of the artifact, the psychological breakdown, the grotesque transformations. He warned them to quarantine the moon, to destroy the artifact, to prevent the entity from ever reaching Earth. As he typed, the comms officer began to convulse, his body writhing on the floor. The glowing light in his eyes intensified,